thanks to the organisers, to Phil in particular, wherever he is lurking, and also to his introduction actually, which is, so I've now got a slight uncertainty about quite which direction to go in, because I don't know whether to respond to the provocation of his introduction or to say what I was going to say anyway. So I shall probably try and do both, and therefore will be even more confusing. In particular, I'm interested in this notion of living with, and also living with environmental change. And I think I don't like any of those words, really. Living with, well, with is okay, but living. Environment I don't like, and also change, to my mind, is too well, simple or passive or whatever. And in fact, I guess that might be something that Nigel will also reflect upon. Let me be, and also I should warn you that I've got rather obsessed by the issue of energy and oil, and I shall, as so many of you were at the talk I gave yesterday will know, that this has become an abiding interest. So I will sort of divert every now and then into issues to do with oil and society rather than what we're meant to be talking about. But let me begin with a quote that I like a lot from Zizek, who says, "Nature is crazy. Nature is one big catastrophe. Oil, our main source of energy, one of our main sources of energy, the main source of energy in the 20th century anyway, can you imagine what kind of ultra unthinkable ecological catastrophe must have happened on Earth in order that we have these reserves of oil? Nature is not Mother Earth, is hugely imbalanced." I kind of quite like that notions, which utterly disrupts anything, any notion of nature as a kind of benign, as Mother Earth, as balanced, and in particular against the idea of anything here which is in equilibrium. I suppose I'm very interested in non-equilibrium, non-linear sorts of processes. So that's sort of one aspect, and therefore it also points to the way in which, I mean, it's kind of to do with the environment, but the environment, to my mind, is a notion that sort of is too in the background to the kinds of events and processes and structures and so on, which seem to be going on and which should be our concern. And so for me, the question of possible or probable changing climate is a question to do with energy, and it's sort of different from, well, it's obviously quite different from many environmental issues. It's a question of the massive external diseconomies or the massive social natural contradictions set up by particular kinds of energy use, and in particular the energy use of this ultra unthinkable ecological catastrophe stretching over hundreds of millions of years, which had the result of producing something which we call oil, and which through a very set of contingent transformations to do with refining practices and so on, happened to result in something which we can put into horseless carriages and into aeroplanes and turn into plastics and turn into fertilizers. So that to me is a more, I don't call that to do with the environment, I think is actually not the correct way of thinking about this. Anyway, in this book that Phil and Matt very kindly referred to, I suppose I try to say something a bit more about the issues of energy and society. And I suppose that if I was, kind of thinking about the essay questions that I've been set here, or the speakers have been set here, it seemed to me the sort of, I suppose that would be one kind of essay answer would be to say, well, it's all to do with energy, which actually, of course, was also present in Phil's talk, because he was interested in energising. But there are lots of different ways and forms of energising. And in the talk I gave yesterday, I quoted the small is beautiful Schumacher, who said, there is no substitute for energy. The whole edifice of modern societies, and indeed all societies we should say, is built upon it. It's not therefore just another commodity, but the precondition of all commodities, a basic fact equal with air, water and earth. And I quite think that's the significance there of energy is particularly profound. And this has given rise, seems to me, in a much more sort of straightforward way, gives rise to two utter contradictions or market failures or external diseconomies or risks. So for me, framing the issue should always be in terms of these kinds of utterly huge diseconomies or risks, one of which is what Nicholas Stern calls the world's greatest ever market failure, namely namely probable climate change, and what I think is the world's second greatest market failure, which is using up at least half of the world's supply of oil during the 20th century, using a source of energy or using a source which had been laid down over hundreds of millions of years at an astonishing rate during the 20th century. So, what might be my further sort of thoughts about living with climate change? Well, one of the things is obviously that human activities are utterly complicit within the processes by which this energy has been deployed, and so on. And in a way, one of the paradoxes is the sciences of climate change have shown how human behaviour has made such a difference. So it actually means, therefore, that the sciences show that there is a need for studying human behaviour. And as somebody said, Phil said earlier, the economists are normally the kind of the disciplinary group which have sort of utterly kind of monopolised, colonised the issue of human responses to climate change. But it's quite interesting actually looking at the Stern Review. If you've read all 700 pages of the Stern Review, which I sort of turned the pages at least, and as the book goes on, as the report goes on, it becomes more and more the case that Stern and his collaborators encounter things such as social customs which they find quite troublesome, because they say, well, social customs are not really explicable by economics. But they then don't go on to say, well, maybe we should look at what other people have thought about social customs. So there is a sort of interesting kind of gap, but a sort of interesting gap in the Stern Review, taking that as a sort of significant example of economic contributions. So my main point is secondly, having said something about energy, is to say we should then turn to what are some of the limits of economic models. So that seems to be the most important framing of climate change outside the sciences is by economics. This is, utterly significant discourse. It's found in, much of IPCC reports. It's found in the Stern Review, and it's found in public policy. So if there's a sort of contribution that we ought to be making, it would first of all be to challenge the economic framing. So firstly, I think there are various limits of economics. I speak as somebody who was a sort of once did an economics degree, so I'm a sort of converted economist. Actually, when I did my economics degree, it's exactly the same sort of failings as people now identify it having, which is sort of interesting. Anyway, first of all, obviously, in the contemporary world, economic institutions are extremely important. But actually economics doesn't say very much about that, and tends to treat the economy as a set of market processes relatively under-influenced by the scale, impact, organisational capacity of the entities that make up the economy, or the economies. And in particular, there are huge social and political consequences that follow from economic organisations and entities, which again, if you look at the Stern Review, there's absolutely nothing about. And in particular, of course, there are huge global corporations with vast interests in the business as usual of carbon capitalism. So I think one of the dangers here is simply to ignore, denigrate the significance of what I call carbon capitalism and its social and political effects. So that seems to be one limit of economics. Second limit of economics seems to me not to treat energy with sufficient attention. Energy is often treated by economists as generating something like 5% of the GDP of an economy, because this is roughly what it costs. But it seems to me carbon-based energy is a very unique bundle of non-renewable commodities. So in a sense, the non-renewability of most energy sources, and especially of some, is something that's not really part of that, and hence the point from Schumacher that energy is not like any other commodity. Thirdly, most of the time people do not behave as individually rational economic consumers. People are creatures of social habituation. And of course there is the new economics of nudge, which I'm not going to talk about, although I'm indeed not very interested in, but there is another economics there which sort of does treat something of the habitual character of economic behaviour, but standard economics does not deal sufficiently with social habits and routines, and the way in which those habits and routines get sort of established and into which people's behaviour gets locked. So I think the importance of the lock-in to both kind of consumer and productive behaviour is particularly significant, and in particular through media and advertising. And again, something economists they treat advertising as a sort of an area of economic activity, but not in terms of the social and political consequences. So the ways in which habits become widespread and embodied, although now having thought about my elbow a bit more, I realise that's a very poor way of putting it. And in particular, those habits become widespread and embodied social practices which are hard to reverse. I'll come back to social practices in just a minute. Fourthly, interestingly though, changes in habits do occur from time to time, and they can occur very rapidly. And such as the growth of mobile telephony, which Phil demonstrated so effectively in the middle of his talk. So the way in which, of course, 15, 18 years ago would have been inconceivable that that everybody in the room would have been carrying around what I call a sort of miniaturized mobile machine, and which was probably consulted by everybody in the room during the course of the day in order to catch up with their friends, family, and professional contacts. So on the one hand, things can remain enduring, routines, habits, and those routines and habits can spread around the world. So that's one kind of very important point. But the second point is that suddenly change can happen, and it can occur very rapidly, such as there can be a passing of a threshold or a tipping point, and suddenly everybody has to have a mobile phone, just as the classic study of this was in the 1990s, when every office had to have a fax machine. You became not an office unless you had a fax machine. Now, it's kind of a funny thing to think about in retrospect, but of course people in 10 years' time, mobile phones will be so past it that there will be something completely different. So the rapidity of some change, I think, is one of the things that's very important, and the stability of others. And I think that kind of relates a little bit, we'll relate in a minute, to what I'm going to say about fashion. Well, the fifth point is that I'm extremely interested in what is it that would consist of developing low carbon systems and low carbon lives. It seems to me that the only way those might become profoundly significant and transformative of the energy processes that we've got locked into would be if they become matters of new fashion. And I think that kind of relates to the points about sort of passion, but I suppose I kind of put it in slightly other terminology of fashion. And again, economic studies seem to deal pretty poorly, and probably most social sciences deal pretty poorly with processes that become overnight matters of fashion. And the fashion could obviously be of new forms of politics, or new forms of products, or new kinds of processes, or whatever. So those seem to be the limits of economics, and they seem to be quite significant, or very significant limits. This suggests that economic frameworks are moderately unhelpful. So we have to think a bit more about habits and routines. Actually, some of the sorts of high carbon social practices and routines, some examples of that, and I also don't like the term referring to these as behaviour. I think they're absolutely they're not behaviour, which is to my mind too much of a psychologistic term. They are social practices such as overseas holidays, driving to the shops, showering daily, as Elizabeth Shove has endlessly discussed, the school run, drinking foreign beers and wines, having second homes, climate control rather than clothing control, driving through well-lit streets, dining out, global friendships, and working on projects with a global team, and 1,000 or so, tens of thousands of others. But those seem to be the kinds of high carbon social practices. They presuppose lots of other people. They all presuppose all sorts of elements of the material world. They imply all sorts of embodied processes and practices. They all involve the assemblage of the different elements that come to sustain those different social practices. And those are the things that have to change. Or rather, what is to be done about those and the other 1,000 or so significant social practices? And those are the social practices are, to my mind, also very much to do with systems. Each of them presuppose one or a number of systems, and for me systems are simultaneously economic, physical, technological, political and social, I suppose loosely socio-technical. There are complex connections between different systems, of course, and no tendency for those systems to be or remain in equilibrium. There can be all sorts of non-linear changes, non-linear relationships. But sort of once established, these systems cluster. I'm very interested in the sort of the first half of the 20th century, when you got a clustering of high carbon systems that sort of got locked in together, and which is incredibly difficult to sort of extricate one system out of that cluster. And actually that also relates to, I think, whatever might happen in terms of what I said of new fashion. The new fashionable low carbon living and low carbon systems would have to be a cluster, and not just a sort of, oh well, we'll have electric vehicles, but the rest of our lives go on as ever. It has to be a reformed clustering, as there was a forming of the cluster in the first half of the 20th century, but first in the US and then sort of globally. David Nye describes this. I quoted him yesterday in the talk. He talked about a high energy regime, this is in the first half of the 20th century, touched every aspect of daily life. It promised a future of miracle fabrics, inexpensive food, large suburban houses, faster travel, cheaper fuels, climate control and limitless growth. Even the music of the emerging counterculture was plugged in. That's quite an interesting, amusing quote. Anyway, so there was a high energy regime formed of a cluster of processes, systems, habits. And as I also said yesterday, that involved an astonishing reliance upon this ultra unthinkable ecological catastrophe stretching back 400 million years of oil. And I'll just quote the fact that almost all over 95% of transportation energy in the modern world is oil-based. It's an element of at least 95% of all manufactured goods. It's crucial to at least 95% of food production for a rising world population through irrigation, transport, pesticides, fertilizers. And according to the International Energy Authority, oil supply peaked in 2006, so that roughly in the 20th century, half of the apparent reserves, and that's a hugely problematic concept, was used up. So in the future there will only be tough oil rather than easy oil. And therefore my argument would be that we need to find reverse gear. So I think that's why I don't really like the term living with, because actually I think it's reversal. It's to go into reverse, but to go into reverse in a way which is fun and fashionable. How can you do that? Well, I think how can you do that? Asking you the question is quite silly in a way. And one of the problems is there are such powerful forces stopping the reversal. So let me just run through 8 processes in some sense that would stop the reversal. So first of all, there are systemic carbon interests who are themselves causing the rising greenhouse gas emissions. And this is, we might call, what others have called a wicked problem to deal with. Secondly, there are the long-term path dependencies of existing systems. Thirdly, that at least in the short term, to move to low carbon, would involve significant reductions in measured income and measured consumption. I use carefully the term measured there. Fourthly, the difficulties of orchestrating a global polity to reset global agendas. Fifthly, the general slowness of societal change, which is I've sort of referred to. Sixth, the ways in which states are rarely able to bring about change from the top, partly because there is such a lot of resistance and opposition, fortunately, by people who are kind of affected by these sorts of changes. I'm very struck by the data on the scale of opposition and resistance in China to a huge array of issues to do with work, water, irrigation, environment and so on. Seventh, the lack of time available to make a seismic global shift, since of course since already fantastically significant atmospheric changes are already in the system, and don't disappear simply because you reduce future rates of greenhouse gas emissions. And eighth, the need to change multiple systems simultaneously to generate this new carbon cluster. So, what to be done about this? Well, I rather like a quote from Buckminster Fuller. I've often said this. You never change, he says, anything by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And we had a brief discussion of that in the session yesterday, and I think it's very interesting. It's a bit like Kuhn's account of scientific revolutions. The old folks die out, and the new paradigm and the young Turks take over. And there's something kind of similar in his account there of socio-technical change. So that might be one kind of way to think about some of these sorts of transformations. And but of course, it's very important to resist anything which looks like a kind of technology-first approach. The magic, what I like to call these days, the sort of magic bullet solution. So I guess we should presume that there is no magic bullet, that there is no simple one solution, but nevertheless there may be some things which could be so transformative through tipping points and so on. So what I wanted to do, just to think about for, I'm kind of running out of time I think as well, just think about what might have to happen if we were to take one of the systems that I'm particularly interested in, and that is travel. So if we were thinking about new ways of living with travel, we might want to say that any new system of travel that would kind of going to spring up and make the old system obsolete would have to provide flexibilised, comfortable and secure personal mobility, but not oil dependent. It would have to be a system which does not thus displace many of the affordances currently provided by cars, such which are, as myself and many people I've been writing with have said, which are aesthetic, emotional, sensory, flexible and sociable. It's not therefore just a means of transport at all. So what I've called the innovation of a post-car has to become an object of consumer fashion, and not simply involving loss or limits, to use again Phil's phrase, or even nostalgia. It has to be a system that is fashionable and faddish, that wins hearts and minds, that is better and more fun, as indeed, of course, the mobile phone is better and more fun than the old phone that sits on a lead somewhere in the corner of the room. In fact, I think thinking about that kind of comparison, what's the low carbon equivalent of mobile phones? It's kind of interesting. Indeed, such an innovation system has to be imagined so that it has to be something a little bit like Virginia Woolf. In 1927, when Virginia Woolf got their first car, I don't know which household combination it was at the time, Virginia Woolf noted, "Yes, the motor car is turning out to be the joy of our lives, an additional life, free and mobile and airy. Soon we shall look back at our pre-motor days as we do now at our days in the caves." Which is a fantastic quote, I think. And so so something similar would have to happen. We would have to have a whole array of low carbon systems and lives that would mean that future avant-garde novelists could not imagine life without perhaps driverless vehicles, smart cars, zero emissions and virtual meetings, and a panoply of other kinds of new, fun and fashionable kinds of entities, similar to the way in which Virginia Woolf wrote so evocatively about the current car in 1927. Okay, I'll stop there.